Hello, and welcome to our live webcast, Meet PESTLE, a risk monitoring framework for meeting environmental, social, and governance expectations. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Don, and I'll be the operator for the presentation. Before we get things started, I'd like to take a moment to acquaint you with a few features of this web event technology. At any time, you may adjust your audio using any computer volume settings that you may have. On the right-hand side of your screen, you'll see the Q&A window. There's a large window which holds all of your sent questions and a smaller text box at the bottom where you will type in your questions. To send us a question, please click in the text box and type your text. When finished, click the send button. We are joined today by our speaker, Powana Berlicote. Powana is Global Product Manager at LexisNexis. Before joining LexisNexis, Powana led the development and launch of procurement and spend management products for SciQuest and managed diverse product portfolios for PeopleFluent and IBM Connexa. Powana's wealth of experience in the user-centric design and agile development has fueled her passion for solving customer pain points and providing thought leadership on risk mitigation in the procurement and supply chain management community. So with no further ado, Powana, welcome. I'll turn the audience over to you now.
All right. Thank you, Don. That's a really lovely introduction. Welcome, everybody. Thank you for joining us. So today I'm going to take you briefly through who we are. We are partnering with ISM. So I work as a group product manager for LexisNexis. We are a provider of legal, regulatory, and business information. So most of us here are here to make sure that our customers can make informed decisions based on the content and the technology that we provide our customers with. We operate across 175 countries. We have 10,000 employees worldwide. And our parent company is Reed Elsevier Group, also known as the RELX Group. And our overall portfolio, it's a world-leading provider of information and analytics for professional and business customers. So you might hear LexisNexis in context of risk, in context of legal content, and also in terms of supply chain and risk management. So we have a host of offerings. For today's purpose, we're going to talk about PESTLE. That is, I will go through all of the acronyms that I have here today. I will break it down for you guys so you don't have to just wonder what all they are. Some of them are pretty mainstream these days. So a lot of people do understand what ESG might be, what CSR is. PESTLE is how we define industry risk. There are 6 different angles. So today's agenda would be to cover what are the key components of ESG, what is CSR. So it's the environmental, social, and governance. CSR is for corporate social responsibility programs. And then how do you use PESTLE framework? It stands for political, economic, social, technological, legal, and environmental. How do you use that framework to focus on quickly identifying the risk that's emerging in your space? And then finally, we're going to talk about combining of this entity due diligence and this ongoing monitoring solution. That way you have the risk visibility at all times across your supplier base. And the end goal is, you are able to build this trust between your suppliers, between yourself, and at the end, you're going to do good business out of it. So I'm going to just quickly start with a poll question. I want to gauge how you guys are using it, your level of understanding.
And our polling question is currently being displayed on your screen, and we thank you for participating in our interactive polling today. This is our first of 5 questions. We'd like to know, do you know what ESG stands for? Please choose either yes or no, and we'll leave the polling open for a while here to give you an opportunity to record your response. Again, do you know what ESG stands for? Yes or no response option. And the voting has slowed here, so we will end the poll and share the results. 85.3% of those who responded, Powana, said the answer is no.
All right, I'm just going to make that note here. 85% said no. So I'm kind of glad I gave the introduction right away. So let me go ahead and close the poll. All right, thank you, Don. So maybe because some of the practitioners keep saying, we're going to do ESG, right? So you might hear that and you kind of wonder, what is that, right? I wonder sometimes, but why are all of these acronyms floating around? Are there KPIs tied to it? Am I being measured against it? Is this a regulation? Is this a desire? So we'll just start with what it is. It's a very foundational level, right? So we're not going to there's another poll coming up. Can we?
And our second poll is currently displayed on your screen. We're wondering, what do you know what PESTLE stands for?
Yeah.
And we have yes, no, or never heard of it. And the votes are coming in.
All right.
We'll allow a little bit of time here for folks to record their response. The voting is slowing here. And we will end the poll, share the results. 47.3% said no, 37.8% said never heard of it, and 14.8% said yes.
Awesome. Okay. All right. So it's perfect, right? So you have, I think, majority of the audience, and it's good for me to kind of understand where the audience comes from. That way I know how much detail you might need or how much an overview you need. I think we are still at an overview stage, and not surprisingly, because these are kind of new standards coming to companies, coming to corporations to manage your risk and operate in a certain way that wasn't required before, right? Some of the regulations are well known, so not to do anti-bribery, not to do anti-corruption, and things like that. But a lot of these ESG frameworks sometimes are mandatory, sometimes are not, and then just trying to get an understanding of what it is. So there's a simple definition for ESG, which is environmental, social, and governance. It's a generic term, and usually there is no official definition that exists. Each company will, or each provider will have their own definition of ESG, but it's defined usually in the capital markets, and they're mostly used by investors to see, do I want to invest in this company or not? And there are certain indicators within the ESG that will tell the users how successful your company is going to be. And me as an investor wants to monitor you against these in ESG, so your environmental, social, and your governance and this framework to say, if I put my money in this company, they are going to succeed because their risk is going to be managed in a certain way that I have visibility. So usually they're looking for non-financial performance indicators by monitoring for ESG. So they've gone past to say, just show me your books, right? Show me your accounts. I will, sit in a room, do analysis for a month, and then I will decide if you are going to be profitable or not for me as an investor. That's still pretty much, there. But now we have added in a layer to say, I want to see different type of non-financial performance indicators. That way I can start monitoring for, are you going to be sustainable? Are you going to be an ethical business? And are there going to be any corporate governance issues? And do you have a way to manage it? For example, what are you going to do about your carbon footprint? So there are multiple agencies, and they all have their own guidelines on what to measure for. One of the leaders is the European Federation of Financial and Listed Societies. It's also called EFSAS. So they have defined these 9 core areas of monitoring. So they say, we want to see if you're going to be energy efficient. Do you have the greenhouse gas, the GHG emissions? What's your staff turnover like, right? What's your training and qualification like? Do you have, learning and, growing within your careers internally? What's your maturity of the workforce, right? Are you working with a really mature workforce? Are you working with maybe not the top of the line quality of employees? Do you have enough diverse employee in your portfolio? Absenteeism, right? Do people show up to work, right? So if you're looking at large factories and you are relying on the volume of workers to actually get the job done, do you need a certain threshold of employees to be there at all times? Do you have backup plans? What are the litigation risks, right? Is there any corruption that exists? And maybe it might be easy to monitor in one market, but might not be so visible when you're looking at, broad sort of offices all over the world. What is the revenue pipeline like from new products, right? Does this company intend to make revenue from what it already has by just selling more and more of it? Or does it plan on launching new products? And what does that do to the market? Are they disruptors? So there are various things that might not have been so much of a consideration in the beginning. Even 20 years ago, this wasn't thought of as a criteria to evaluate a company to say, do I want to invest in these? And these are not just people like doing personal investment, right? These are large corporations trying to either acquire a company or invest majorly in a market. So all of these things that companies are probably monitoring on their own. So your HR grouping might be monitoring for workforce, making sure you have diverse employees, you have different age and race and all that. You also have training programs, you have learning programs. Your culture is a good fit, right? So you might be doing all of that, but they might not be talking to, another group which might be doing just litigations, and you don't know how many litigation your company is facing right now, right? Is there patent infringement going on? So all of those things are not coming together yet. And the purpose of ESG is to bring in all of these different elements of risk that lives within the company to one single place. And then you can just say, what is the ESG score for company X? So it helps the users make some kind of informed decision. So there's a little bit of graphics here I'm going to share. So if you look at it, the corporations themselves, so there's 65% of them, and this is a PwC data, 65% of the corporations say that it's very important for the core business strategy. So they are trying to actively monitor for ESG themselves to say this is really important for me. But from the investor side, they say, well, 31%, which is a much smaller number, say it's very important that they use this ESG to make investment decisions. So they are looking at it, but they haven't really gotten past that majority yet where it's not the only deciding factor. So they are still looking at books, they're still looking at financial indicators, and we will touch a little bit later about the CSR, the corporate social responsibility, which is a little bit more important for investors than it is for the corporations. So here there's the United Nations SDG, it's a Sustainable Development Goals, and there are 17 of the global goals. It was set in 2015 by the United Nations, and the goal is to end poverty, protecting the planet, and ensuring prosperity for all. Right? It sounds something like an UN would say, right? Very, make the world a better place to live, right? And do an ethical business kind of goal. That's a really lofty goal, but they have done a really good job of, breaking it down into attainable components, right? So the SMART goal principle, right? Can it be attained? Can it be attained within the time frame that it is set? So in 2030, so they have given 15 years to say all of these corporations need to behave, and there are 17 specific goals that we have tied to either companies or a country, a region. And when we meet all of these goals, right, that you will be meeting the SDG goal. So a lot of the goals have been adopted by corporations and very proactively, right? A lot of corporations are here to do good business, to do ethical business, and to promote, right, prosperity for all kind of concepts. And that has been led mostly by the top down. So a lot of the CEOs of the major companies are coming together, and they have formed their own coalition to decide how do you attain this goal by 2030. So one of and I wanted to quote a little bit from BlackRock CEO, Larry Fink. So he's one of those coalitions of CEO of major organizations. And he sent out email to his colleagues, the CEOs, and he said, to prosper over time, every company must not only deliver financial performance, but also show how it makes a positive contribution to the society. Companies must benefit all of their stakeholders, including shareholders, employees, customers, and the communities in which they operate. Right? So this is his, friendly request to his fellow CEOs to say these are the type of, goals we should be pursuing. Financial is still very important. It helps us run a successful business, but there are other considerations beyond financial that we need to consider. So, and they put their money in it, right? So it's not just in paper, like, somebody goes to a conference room, comes up with great goals, right? And it's not just ideas. it is actually in reality they have started investing based on those goals, and which companies are meeting those ESG goals and which companies are not. They have started investing funds in the companies that have ESG performance goals incorporated as part of their business and companies that are not. So what they've done is they have made a group of about 400 world's largest companies, and this sustainability index is similar to your NASDAQ or your S&P index. What they have done is these kind of companies who have pledged to follow certain standards, the UN Global Compact standards, the Sustainable Development Goals, the Climate Disclosure Standards, right, Sustainable Accounting Standards. So based on the goals that these individual organizations have, how do those companies perform? So from those, so out of this 400 organization, it shows 300 firms that disclosed a commitment to the SDG. Then they set up a fund to invest in them. In the fund's first year of operation, it gave a return of 27.6%. So that the very, the highest curve you see on your screen, that is how well this company has performed. It outperformed all other indexes, including, the sustainability-based funds. So there is money, right, to be made. So if the company's goal is to be an outstanding performer financially, right, it is actually helping those companies by adopting the ESG goals. So it makes, a financial gain. So you're happy, right? Your profits are going up. You are doing well financially. You're strong. You can invest more. But at the same time, you are also making a world, right, a better place, because each of these organizations have their own goals to make either, all of them are treated fairly, your employees are treated fairly, your supply chain is clean, there is no modern slavery, there is no, the corruption going on, so there's accounting board guidelines. So all of those combined is actually providing profits to the company. And I'm going to go a little bit ahead and talk about CSR, and this is corporate social responsibility, right? What it is and how is this different than CSR, the ESG, which is the environmental, social, and governance. So I'll start with a basic definition. Right, during the poll, we saw that not everybody thinks of these as common household terms yet. The corporate social responsibility is continuing the commitment by businesses to behave ethically and contribute to economic development while improving the quality of life of the workforce and their families as well as the local community. Very similar to the BlackRock CEO's email. He was, urging his fellow CEOs to make similar commitments, which is to say, we know from ESG standards, ESG is a little bit more numeric, a little bit almost a quantitative view, whereas CSR is a little bit hard to quantify, but these are goals that companies want to meet. So there is a lot of chatter going on, when do you meet it? What happens if I don't do it, right? So there's always an option to not meet the ESG guidelines or the CSR guidelines and operate the way you are today. And there are certain downfalls to not complying because your peers might be complying and they might be either seeing direct financial gains because of that, or in this economy, in this market, right, everybody is very consumer-oriented space. You are losing your reputational risk, right? If people don't see you as a favorable company, people see you as the bad guy in the industry, right? And there are losses that you're going to get because of that, your consumers' perception of who you are as a company. So I'm going to give you a little bit of an example here. And two of the companies are kind of opposite, right? One's making ice cream, Ben & Jerry's, and the other one is Apple Corporation. And just the kind of a storytelling about how they went about adopting some of these goals. And also some of them have been proactive and say, this is what I want to do. This is what ethical means to me. This is what CSR, corporate social responsibility, means to me as a corporation. And this is what I'm going to measure myself against. So you can take, stance and extremes to say, I will set my own goals that are, reflecting, that are borrowed from some of those UN goals and based on what I want to accomplish. Or you can say, well, I'm not going to comply for now, right? We'll just see. When I really have to comply, I will comply. So what happened with Apple, so we'll do this one first. Apple declined say, I don't want to participate. And there is this another project, it's called Carbon Disclosure Project, right? This is around disclosing your carbon footprint. And we all know Apple does a lot of manufacturing. A lot of the manufacturing is done around the globe, right, in Asia. So they said, no, I don't want to participate in it. I don't really care about it. And the CDP, the Carbon Disclosure Project, is an independent global system for companies. Their job is to measure, disclose, manage, and share climate change and water information. So they are global organizations. They are doing this for multiple other corporations. But Apple says, not for me. I don't want to participate. And 3,700 other companies worldwide regularly participate in the CDP monitoring program. So, and it also happens to be the only largest IT firm that declined to participate. And after, that's just saying, it's kind of optional. Nobody's really forcing you to make these choices, and a company made a choice not to participate, and that's all right, right? That's their business decision. But then what happened is in 2012, Apple themselves produced a progress report on its supplier responsibility, right? Am I responsible? Am I showing all of these, these ethical business practices to my customer? And when they showed the progress report, the company revealed that almost 2/3, right, so 62% of its suppliers do not comply with its limit of 60 hours per week in the factory. So there are multiple things happening here. So as a corporation, and that's why when you don't lead it from top down, right, when a CEO or an executive level management doesn't take a stance and say, this is how we want to operate as a company, you're sending a message downstream that these things are not important. So your employees might not adhere, right? They might not follow the rules that you might want them to follow. And that's when you're starting to look at, the bribery, corruption practices, right, unethical business practices flowing through. For suppliers get a message that, hey, if my company, like my customer, who is Apple, doesn't care about, how we are performing, how we comply to all of the standards, I don't have to either, right? So you kind of send this very indirect message that you are not required to follow certain standards. And they themselves realize that it's not, right? It's not performing well. The supplier base are routinely overworking the workers that are building your Apple products. And then on top of that, right after the 2012, the Apple CEO, Tim Cook, he announced that he said, this is a lot of negative publicity, right? So their reports, their progress reports is showing negative data. They are not partnering very well with the rest of their peers who have already partnered with other agencies to monitor for their environmental footprint. So they said, you know what, we are going to do our own. And this is the example I started with earlier, is they then take this corrective step and they say, this is what we will do. So they said the 62% of our supplier base not complying with the labor practices, it's not okay. So they actively joined the Fair Labor Association, the FLA, as a member. And Apple thus became the first high-tech industry company to join that group. So it's usually done mostly for the manufacturing, the high labor force industries, not necessarily the high-tech companies. But they said that they will start independently reporting on their supply chain activities. So they saw a red flag. So first they said, no, we don't care about it. They saw a red flag. They decided to correct it. And they are going to start, publicly putting out reports on their progress and how they are doing, and are the workforce, complying with certain labor standards. So that's the Apple story. Ben and Jerry, on the other hand, they are more of a proactive space, right? So they are not taking a back seat, and then when something goes back, they are coming and correcting. They, as a company, have they have their own ethical ways of operating. I think they have the Ben and Jerry's principles. The name slips my mind, but they have a really catchy name for what their motto is as a company. But their goal, and this was back in 2013, before people even started talking about corporate social responsibilities, they said, our commitment as a company is to be fully fair trade across the global flavor portfolio, right? So they were not taking a stance around, I will only do it for this market or only do it for certain products. It wasn't that. They wanted to send a very strong message top down that this is something we're going to do, and these are our goals. So what that meant is they said that for all of their products that they're manufacturing, all of the ingredients that went into their ice cream products had to be certified by the FlowCert, so that we made sure that it was fair trade. So we think of ice cream, right? So it's not just the milk, right? You have the paper products that goes with it. You have the flavors. You have chocolate. You have nuts. There's a major global sourcing going on within Ben & Jerry's, and they have just made this a global standard. If you don't fall into this fair trade, they are not going to consume that product. They are not going to use it, or you're not going to be the supplier. And they routinely audit companies across the world, even farms, right, and farmers, how they're being treated, in third world countries, and their focus has been primarily in Africa. They make sure that the farmers are not being exploited when they're doing sourcing, right, and they're using environmentally sound practices, and they are not harvesting crops in a way that is not sustainable, right? So the farm is there to support the farmers and their family, and they produce more so that they can, sell it, and that selling has to be ethical. You cannot underprice them, right? They have to earn fair wages while doing the work. So they have certain standards that's how they want to operate as a business, and it has trickled all the way down to an individual life, right? So a farmer working in his field, maybe just growing in a cocoa, all knows, right, that they will be treated fairly. And it's not just Ben & Jerry's. There are a host of other companies who have said this is how we want to do it for coffee, right? Just regular day-to-day food and products that we consume. That kind of standard has been applied. But I would say Ben & Jerry's kind of started really early on to just own this. Okay, so I'm going to take just a little bit break because that's the ESG and a CSR component of it, the environmental, social governance, and corporate social responsibility. And we want to move a little bit towards how do I get started? It just seems like, kind of pie in the sky, really high-level concept. How do I start adopting these practices within my organization? And that's when we introduce PESTLE, which is the political, economic, social, technological, legal, and environmental framework for monitoring for risk. So I'm going to go to the poll question and give some time to get the answers.
All right, here we go. Our third interactive polling question currently displayed. Does your organization have framework to measure ESG? And you have the options of yes or no. And once again, we thank you for participating in our interactive polling today, and we'll allow some time for those votes to roll in again. Does your organization have framework to measure ESG? Please choose either yes or no. And the voting has slowed here. So we'll share the results. 72.9%, Puana, of those who responded said no.
Okay. And I think there is one more poll question.
Yes, there is. We'll get that displayed here. And our next polling question is CSR important to your organization's leadership? Again, is CSR important to your organization's leadership? Again, a yes or no response option for you, and the votes are coming in quickly here. We'll allow a little more time for you to record your response. People are very prompt today, and the voting has slowed here, so we will share the results. 77.9% of those who responded said yes, CSR is important to the organization's leadership.
Yes, thank you. So that was really, really insightful for me. And then when I was thinking of this overall presentation, I was trying to think, right, what do I really want to understand between how companies are adopting these various principles, right, the various ways of measuring yourself. And the answer, right, the ESG, do you have a framework to measure? No, it doesn't really surprise me. It was coming to almost 72%, because it is a little bit of harder. It's hard to get your arms around something that seems just very vague. It includes everything about your environment, everything about your social society, and everything about governance, right? It's just, where do you get started? But not even though if you don't have that, fully defined, I think most of the corporations, most of the corporate citizens understand that corporate social responsibility is very important. And it is important for the leadership, it is important for you as an employee, right? So I think there is this disconnect, and something that is so important, 78% said yes, it is very important, but about the same numbers, but I don't know how to do this. I don't really have a framework to measure it. Right, so it tells an interesting story, and because I think a lot of corporations are in the same boat where you know you need to do certain things, but you just don't know how to get started. So we have, now I'm going to quickly segue into the PESTLE framework, and I will take you through each of the P, the E, S, T, L, E. That way you get a little bit of a more concrete idea on what you're looking for, what you're trying to measure. That way it's not so vague, right? So I don't want you to go through kind of the same experience that you go to the UN, the Sustainable Development Goals. You get a list of 17 things to do, and then you don't know how to measure them. So we need to go through all of this together. So PESTLE overall, it's an analysis framework. So it's an analytical tool that has all of the 6 components, so we'll break it down one by one. But the goal is to help evaluate the supply chain for overall risk, right? Where does the risk live within each of these frameworks? And by modeling risk by these different categories, you can focus your risk mitigation efforts. So your goal, let's say, is to say, I don't want to engage in anything that has, bad environmental impact. I want to make sure that my carbon footprint is good, my wastewater treatment program is clean, right? And so if your focus is environmental based on your industry, you're going to focus quickly out of the 6 into one goal and to say, for this year, this is going to be my risk area. A focus is environmental. And this is what I'm measuring for. And when I get something that is high risk and it is environmental, I'm going to take action, or I'm going to identify stakeholders that needs to take action, but I'm not going to just turn a blind eye to it. Or you might say my focus right now is socio-cultural. You might say it's economic or it's political, that you're a company that is starting to, open branches all around the world and you're seeing a lot of political instability, right? Maybe you're thinking, what does Brexit have to do with it? Or do I need to adjust for that? So if that is your focus, that's what you're going to measure. So you don't have to do just one. For companies, very routinely, they focus on maybe 2 to 3 out of the 6 that is attainable. And again, SMART goals, right? You need to be able to define it, measure it, attain, right? So you need to be able to solve it within certain times. So this is just a framework that we provide to say this is an easier way to look at it because it's not one big bucket of ESG. It is broken down and it's also measurable, and there is an action tied to it. So I will move on to the first one out of the 3, which is the political. And the definition here, right, it's the various types of risk that's around geopolitical activities, right? So there is the politics itself, right? So your government and presidents and your legislations, everything's changing, right? The global leadership changing, those are big political events. But it is really strongly tied to how you do import from that company, how you do exports, and especially this all summer and spring, we've been talking about the trade wars, right? We've been talking about tariff wars, and we're hearing about, we're going to put additional tariffs on aluminum. And then Canada will say, we're going to put additional tariffs on ketchup, right? So it has happened. So it has impact on overall business activities, and really not much because of any of the things that the corporation themselves have done, right? So they are usually on the receiving end of a much broader risk events happening. It also has impact on violence, right? There's going to be strikes, there's going to be closures, right? There's wars going on, there's wars, there's dictatorships, like who comes into the leaderships, and various government policies, government policies that are trying to protect themselves. So that's kind of economic nationalism, right? You build everything yourself. You self-sustain yourself, different than a global commercialized kind of a capitalist economic. And then you have populism, right, around Europe, and it's an example around Brexit, right? You say you want to protect your people first, and this is very much me versus rest of the world mentality. When that kind of the political climate comes into play, the companies are kind of spectators at that point, right? They're watching how things play out. They're seeing if the leadership is going to change, if the things are just going to die down, or it doesn't, and it has big impact on them. And one of the crucial things to know is that as much as you want to be aware of all of these risk events, most of them are unavoidable, right? So we do have, corporate lobbies and all of that, but not a lot of it has been controlled. And you might be able to control in one space or one small regulation, but globally, as a global political environment, corporations cannot control these risk events. So there was a survey, it was done recently by this American Productivity and Quality Center, it's called APOQ. They found out that 63% of the surveyed companies reported having suppliers located in areas of the world that is experiencing political turmoil. So if you look at the supplier base, your worker base, like you might be just outsourcing some of your activities, 63% is a large percentage of your suppliers to be in this risk area. And it's also, you see it from, we are based here in the U.S. today, and we talk about from our side, what does it mean, right? So it's America first. Everything about your policy and your decisions that are being made is America first. That means we back out of the Trans-Pacific Partnership, right? So the TPP has been challenged. We don't want to, follow the Global Climate Compact, right? We say that's not something we want to participate. The North American Free Trade Agreement has been challenged, but we want to renegotiate this. And there is a lot of retaliation going on, and this is just in one country, right? So this is, and then you multiply this with various global economies and a lot of the political change that's been happening. And then you start realizing, what do I do as a corporation? How do I shield myself against this? How much can you write out? And what do you need to actually mitigate, right? So, and then we will touch further on around how you go about that as well. But right now I'm just going through the definition process. And then there's the economic. This is probably a little bit more easier because the economic risk, it's both macroeconomic risk. Corporations have been facing it for years, centuries even, right? So this economic risk does exist, but it has, so we divide it into, two different areas. The microeconomic, which is around, are there losses, layoffs, bankruptcies, the interest rate has been changed, and then there is, overall a risk that you look around is the market volatile, right? Is my industry sinking? Are there innovators? Are there disruptors in the market that are coming and I'm being challenged constantly? Are my products, are my employees, my services I'm offering strong enough to compete in the market? So a lot of the things around economic risk, around interest rate, right? What happens when the interest rate fluctuates up and down? There's a lot of chatter around, again, coming from the ESG goals around minimum wage, right? You want to give them a living wage, not just a minimum wage. What does that have impact it has on my bottom line? Whatever the market price, right? There's taxes, there's additional duties that are constantly being changed by each port, each country. Those are the areas of risk we want to think about. And other very common other economic risk to be aware of is around exchange rate. So there's, just recently we had a lot of, news cycle going on around, how the Turkish, economy, the government, the U.S. government was having a face-off based on the exchange rate. Sometimes there's hyperinflation, right? The economies have collapsed based on that, inflation. There is, again, general government regulations, right, that will affect your investment. There's one kind of a concrete example I wanted to talk about was Amazon, right? So it's a global organization. It faces a lot of economic risk around taxation, inflation rates. There's industry-specific economic growth. And all of these risks, right? So what happened is based on just the exchange rate alone, so the foreign exchange rates, every year, so from 2014, 15, and 16, they kept facing $636 million of loss in 2014 just because of the exchange rates between U.S. dollars and the currencies they were operating in. In 2015, it was $5.2 billion. That is a really big loss, right, just based on one event, which is exchange rate. And in 2016, they had a loss of $550 million. So these are real big losses, and usually something that, the corporation themselves might not have much to control. The third risk is social. And again, we talked a little bit about this during the ESG framework and what the corporate social responsibility means. This risk is to talk about your corporation's code and your social contract. Right? So there is really no forced mandate. Maybe there are some regulations to say you cannot engage child labor. You have to treat your workers, give them minimum wage. They need to have certain benefits, certain access. Those are, small pieces of regulations coming in place to make you a better employer. But there are also unspoken contracts that you as an employer, you as a company have with the society where you operate. And it looks at those kind of risks around. So some of the topics is around, your product recall, right? If there is the E. coli bacteria going on and your food, your meat or your fruits are causing this massive health scare, right? You as a company are responsible for that. Right, there is human rights violations, there is lockout strikes, and there is the health and safety violations that you cannot do as a company. So all of these feed into a social risk. And the reason you're trying to understand all of these kind of risks, and this seems kind of common sense after you review them in a certain framework, is that are your supplier base at any point engaged in any of these, right? So for our majority of the audience here, for the supply management procurement folks, your perspective is coming from an angle of a supplier. Are my suppliers doing all of these? It's not around, is my company doing all of these? Right? So you're constantly trying to monitor for their behavior, their impact, and the way they operate so that it doesn't have negative consequences to you as a company. So, a company with Tyson's food, right, might say, yes, the chicken, caused listeria or the bacteria, but the supplier was a farmer, right, producing chicken. And so you always have to think about, as a corporation, they are going to own, right, that it's their risk that they did not manage or mitigate or did not see it coming, but they have to take ownership of it. And for companies, it's really important to be proactive and to say, these are the type of risk I will not tolerate, right? I have my risk threshold. I can tolerate some of the business events, right, that happens, but I cannot tolerate these. And you define and you make sure that you uphold that standard, and you make your suppliers uphold that standard. So a little bit of an example around, social risks to cut production, right? A lot of businesses will say, I'm just going to get, a cheap supplier. They'll just give me what I need for a really low price in the developing countries. And you really don't know if they are overseeing and following the labor standards rigorously, right? If they are following the modern slavery that you don't want to have within the corporations, but your supplier might be engaging in it. And so in the contracts with the third-party suppliers, it's very important to include the social and reputational risk mitigation framework that you have set internally. That way the suppliers have to comply with your request and your requirements as well. Now we'll move on to the T, which is the technological. And this is a little bit of a confusing one, and I had a big learning curve myself. So there's the difference between what is a technological risk, and you think of as data breach, cyber threat, cyber security, your data being stolen, and all of that. There's power outages, but it's also a little bit operational risk. What happens when things does not go as planned? Like the power outages is one, right? So you're running your office, there's power outage, you're going to have some shutdown, and you're not going to be producing enough. Or your grocery store, just recently I was going to a grocery store, and all of those, the refrigerator section was closed off. And I said, what happened? They said, we had a power outage for two hours, so now we have to throw out everything, and then we will restock the refrigerator section. And that's it's a pretty large grocery store, and it's a lot of waste because there was a power outage, right? That's on a very small scale in one location, but you could have a much broader impact if you're running massive factories, if you're producing medicines and food that needs to be in a certain temperature, right? So you have to follow those as well. Operationally, it could also be strikes, right? So if your port has been closed because, people said we are not going to work, or your pilots starts, say we are going on a strike, right? So those are all events, a little bit more on operational level, but it hurts the overall performance of your supplier, right? So you are, you think of, a whole airline not flying airplanes for a day, right? There's a big impact on travel, big impact in businesses. So a lot of the different type of risk coming. So one of the, probably most recent, it's been a year, so we've had some time, almost a year, we've had the time to settle, but, in the Equifax, the news that broke out, right, that there was a data breach, and it had about 143 million people's record, and it was stolen. and they were sensitive information about people, their social security, right? So there's a lot of data that you did not want to expose publicly was stolen, and they did a really bad management of it. It took them about 6 weeks to even tell the customers that, hey, you have been compromised, your data has been stolen. And the backlash was really strong, right? So the CEO had to step down, and it's just not just the financial damage, they're facing multiple lawsuits, and overall reputational damage. It's just so much to recover from, right? And that was around one of the technological risks is, did they have enough infrastructure in place, enough monitoring program in place to even and first prevent, if not prevent, detect, and then after detection, notify soon enough, fast enough, what they're going to do about this problem, right? So just a lot of point of failures in that example. And we'll move on to the legal risk. So this is another framework we talk about, and it's around, how your supplier, your entity, can encounter various legal action which can cause the damage to either the reputation, the fines, their sanctions. Your governments, other agencies and governments can put you in a blacklist, right? You cannot do business in certain part of the world because of your actions. And then besides that, there is, the more tactical around, okay, your contract has been violated, or you violated the contract, or your supplier did not honor your contract. There is, your patent has been infringed. So there are a lot of different types of legal risk, and this legal also includes some of our regulatory risk as well. So there are different types within the legal bucket. There is different type of risk. Some of them are called, compliance risk, contract risk. There's bribery and corruption risk. So if you look at this compliance risk, so that you have to avoid the financial and legal penalties, you and your suppliers across your supply chain have to comply with the country's laws and regulations. Right? So in this global economy, you cannot feign ignorance and say, oh, I didn't know your country had this law, right? So you are required to comply with that government's laws. And the other contract risk is around when your third-party business partner or supplier, they don't hold up the contract that you've outlined. And you as an organization who receives the goods and services, now have to face the financial and the reputational damage. And then the bribery and corruption, right? There is, you're not complying with the ABC laws, right? So, and the bribery and corruption laws, like there is the FCPA Act, where, you cannot engage in these practices. Recently, there was this big settlement coming out of this FCPA regulations where the drug manufacturers, and then, big, GSK, GlaxoSmithKline, AstraZeneca, Novartis, they were paying the doctors who were working in China to prescribe their medicines. But most of the doctors who were working in China work for government hospitals, so they are considered government employees. So you are bribing a government employee of a country where, you're not complying with its regulations. So GSK, GlaxoSmithKline, had to pay $20 million in penalty. AstraZeneca paid $5 million, and Novartis paid $25 million. And they also agreed to provide, compliance updates to the SEC in 2 years. So there's big risk, right, that's living because, you did not comply with some of the legal requirements that have been put in place. The last one here is the environmental. This risk is around the natural hazards. There's the oil spill, right? There's, again, the natural disasters like tsunamis and tornadoes, fires, so there's a lot of those environmental impacts. And it does lead to a high cost, right? So there's a high cost to, you cannot prevent a lot of these environmental damages, so your operations are going to be on hold, your business is going to be put on hold. And it just introduces so much volatility within your supply chain, right, that you're constantly scrambling for plan B, constantly trying to mitigate, the lost time, and also the unknown and when things are going to end, right? For example, you don't know exactly when the wildfires are going to be put out, right? You don't know when your transportation can take the normal route and a lot of those things. So A lot of these are unpreventable, so you might not be able to prevent them because it's a natural disaster, but you also need to understand that when this happens, what is the impact to me, what is the impact to my suppliers, and how do I plan on mitigating them. So in 2011, and this is an example of Toyota, they had a lot of natural disaster in that time frame. They had their own tsunami, there's been an earthquake, and then on top of it in Thailand, there is big monsoon with big, severe flooding, a lot of deaths. And after all of this happened, so about 800 people died. One of the factories was in Thailand. So that's Toyota supply chain that has been significantly impacted because some of the parts that was made in that area of Thailand. And they had to completely stop production. And it lasted for months because they couldn't get out of it. So, they couldn't get the factory started in time. And within that quarter, just that one quarter alone, and Toyota's profit fell by 18.5%. So that is a big loss based on something that happened in a different country where your supplier was located. And there's also things around, waste management a lot of the time. I live in North Carolina, and just a few years ago there was this big lawsuit going on between the state and one of the energy providers in the area, where they were accused of dumping the coal ash illegally. Right, so they dumped it in a place where they're not supposed to dump it. There's this big fine going on, and there's a lot of this reputational damage that they faced, and also how they are going about mitigating it, right? So unusually, once you face such a setback, the companies react by overcompensating, right? They go way and beyond what they were required to go in the beginning. But that is something that they have to do in order to compensate for something that went wrong that could have been prevented. So that is the last of it, and that's the environmental risk. So hopefully, if we were to run the survey again, you guys will have a little bit better understanding of what that PESTLE framework means to you and how do you adopt. And I want to give you a little bit of a visuals next around, so what does that mean? Like, we walk through all of the 6 different types of risks. You get the concept, you know what they all are. And how do you put it in practice? Now, how do you start measuring them? And earlier in the survey, you guys have said majority of you do not have a way of measuring for them. So this is a framework to say, okay, based on the 6 different angles of risk, right? So the PESTLE angle, what are the key topics that you want to monitor for within each of those topics? So you might say, I want to look at, the bribery, I want to look at fraud, I want to look at labor strikes, or I want to look at slavery, I want to look at child labor. So you have all of those topics identified. All of these are based off of the content that we have. It's based on the news. It's based on the sanctions document that the government produced. Your politically exposed person, maybe they are in a board of the company that your supplier is providing you with. So you want to look at all of this content. You want to look at their financial data, right? What is their credit score like? And you want to say, based on all of these, where is my risk, right? In my economic risk, let's say this is the year I want to focus on, let's say, just economic, social, and technological risk, for example. You are going to narrow down into specific topics that are within those angles, and then you're going to say, okay, was that a high-risk event? Was that a medium-risk event? Was that a low-risk event? So what the technology helps you do is it scans the billions of content sources, and we know your framework. We know you have prioritized, your 3 different risk angles, and you have said you are okay with the low risk because it's just the nature of business. Some of them are always going to be low risk. But for medium risk, you're going to evaluate what it is. But for high risk, you might say, I want to take an action, right? My action is to alert the stakeholder within my company to say your supplier base had high risk. So you need to do something about it. You need to engage in a conversation, or you're going to have a dialogue with your supplier during the QBR process. Whatever process you have as an organization, you have data to help you start the conversation to say, I want to be a responsible citizen here. My company needs to follow these ethical guidelines, and these are the data that I have to show that you as a supplier are not complying with it, and either I need you to comply or I need you to have reasons and why these things are showing up as high-risk events. And this one is, that is kind of a dashboard, a big picture view of what you will see when you're monitoring thousands of suppliers. But the data is very concrete. We are going to look at, and this is an example of a legal risk area. And then let me just quickly find this a little bit small in my font here. So this is around patent infringement. So Apple versus Samsung, they were engaged in the patent infringement fight. It was considered a high risk because depending on if you are an Apple or a Samsung, one of them was going to have a big fine coming their way. So we look at what was happening, what was the event, and this is looked at, it's a news article. We have identified exactly where Apple is mentioned, where Samsung is mentioned, and what about them is being mentioned, and why it is high risk. So when you have something that is so concrete, you have examples of why things are high risk, you can take it and you can start a conversation around what do you want to do now that you have identified the risk. And you are not being blindsided after the event anymore. You're taking proactive steps to say, these are the trends I'm seeing, and please help me with how we want to mitigate these resources. So that is the last of the PESTLE. I think there is just a small survey at the very end.
And this is our final of 5 polls currently displayed. Would you like more information about LexisNexis due diligence and risk monitoring solutions, including how you can save up to 40% on their products? Please choose either yes or no, whichever you would like. And I would assume, Tawana, this is one that we don't necessarily want to or need to share the results. This is more for informational purposes for LexisNexis and ISM.
Yeah.
All right. Awesome.
Okay.
All right. We'll close that out.
Yep. And this is the end of it, right, before we get into the Q&A. And I like this quote by Thoreau, right? Goodness is the only investment that never fails. Right? And I think a lot of corporations have kind of adopted this motto, right? Maybe indirectly, maybe not in the same quotes, but the principles have been adopted by the companies, and we are seeing real financial gains and the impact they are having in the society. So this is the conclusion. Before we just quickly do a Q&A, and I will scan the Q&A sections. I have a couple of questions coming through.
Sounds good, Paulina. While you do that, I'll just remind our audience that the Q&A window is located on the right-hand side of the screen to submit a question. Type your question in the small text box at the bottom, and when finished, click the send button. So at this point, Paulina, I will defer to you for questions from our audience.
Sure. So one of the questions is, who needs to lead the ESG initiative, so the Environmental Social Governance Initiative? And usually, the answer based on what we have seen in the industry is it's usually top down, right? It's usually on a CEO level who will say, I want to participate, I want to be part of this global change makers of companies, and I want to participate. And they, in turn, put goals for their companies and therefore on employees to say, you have to meet certain guidelines. And then you might say to your suppliers, you have to meet certain guidelines if you want to be my supplier, because this is my goal. So it's usually top-down. That's how it has been successfully implemented in other companies. There's another question around how long has this term been used. I'm not sure exactly when that question came through, so it might have been ESG, I'm assuming. So ESG has been used on and off for almost the last 10 to 15 years when I was doing the research for this, but it hasn't really been solidified until products started coming. So there are a couple of solution providers in the market who will say, hey, we will do your ESG analysis, and we will give you a score, and that's probably within the last 5 years or so. There's another question around how can procurement help set ESG guidelines? That is around, we walked through the PESTLE framework monitoring. This is a tool that's available exclusively to serve the procurement and supply chain communities. And this is a way to start conversation with your management to say, hey, there is already a framework that's available that not only tells me what to monitor for, but also tells me how bad it is. Right? So there's already some interpretation of this going on. And that's how you start the conversation to say, let's start with what we can digest, right? And you can always scale up. I will stop there, John, because we only have just about a minute. I think that is the last, I think.
Actually, we can run a couple minutes over, Poana, if you would like.
Okay. There is one more. It says subscription-based service, or is it a SaaS? So the solution, it is a SaaS solution, right? So it's a software as a service. You just subscribe to it, meaning you decide how many entities, how many suppliers you want to monitor for. And that's it, right? So you're not billed on how much content you consume or how many users in your organization need access. It's none of that. It's if you have 5 suppliers to monitor, if you have 500 suppliers to monitor, that's how it is priced, and it's based on just online software, no implementation or installation or anything required. Okay, I think that was the last question, I think.
All right, very good, Poana. I would like to thank you for the outstanding presentation and also thank our audience on behalf of the Institute for Supply Management and LexisNexis. We thank you for your participation in today's event. This concludes today's program. Thank you for joining us, and have a great day.